Brownfield Redevelopment Hurdles in Rural Communities recorded webinar. Today you'll be hearing about a project in Huntington, Indiana, and we'd like to introduce you to the voices you will be hearing throughout the webinar. First, you'll hear from Bob Reeder with LISC, talking a little bit about the opportunities and challenges with brownfields. And then he'll turn it over to three of the partners directly involved in making this project happen. First, John Niederman with Pathfinder Services. Next, Bryn Keplinger with the City of Huntington. And then John Anderson, developer and president of Anderson Partners. And finally, you'll be hearing from Blaze Levin, director of the Technical Assistance to Brownfields program at Kansas State University, supported by EPA.
Kickstart revitalization within a neighborhood. Some opportunities of dealing with these kinds of properties are lower purchase price, of course. We have some curb appeal impacts on the community that make it look better. We're adaptive reusing them, and we can also cut down on green development by having utilizing existing infrastructure. Some of the challenges, of course, are some liability issues, possibly impact on costs and timelines, and then there's always the ever-present money issue of financing complications.
You can see it's color-coded. Now it's coming up on the second floor. And you can see that upstairs, we've designed an artist in residence apartment and artist studio. It's ADA accessible because this is going to be an inclusive arts center for people of all abilities. You can see where the Huntington University Entrepreneurial Program will reside. In that brown area are actually two apartments up there that is part of the 37 apartments that John Anderson is developing. And then you also see that we have private studios. We have a print lab and digital photography studio, and our director will be up there as well. But anyway, some of the conclusions that we have, and which you'll hear about later, is that rural cities and towns need downtown revitalization. From the Huntington experience, the cost of environmental testing was picked up by the EPA. And without the city stepping in and taking ownership and conducting the environmental assessment prior to the developer taking possession, with that, there was a clear understanding and pathway for the developer and other partners to invest in the project. So without that, there would have been probably hesitation. And that paved the way for Rural LISC to continue to invest grant funds into the business planning and eventually into also a grant to help us with our first year of our director. So my key thing is listen very carefully later on to get to know the Brownfield redevelopment staff, people in your area, but also all the resources that are going to be explained on this webinar. And I'm going to be listening as well because we may have other projects in other towns that require revitalization, and it's really critical for rural areas to understand all the resources that can be available to make sure things happen.
Get this started. So I'm Bryn Keplinger, Director of Community Development and Redevelopment for the City of Huntington. And I'm going to sort of provide a historical approach to the actual site, which you'll see on your screen there. This is how it looked in the early 2000s. An older set of buildings, 3 buildings, all connected internally. The unfortunate thing is that the floors don't all line up across the 3 buildings, and you can see that through those windows on that facade. So again, three individual buildings. Starting on the left, the Oddfellows Hall, constructed in 1889. The Oddfellows being a fraternal organization comprising 3 floors of that building at about 13,000 square feet. In 1915, the middle building, or the Trust Building as we call it, again, operated by that fraternal organization, again, about 13,200 square feet. Then the most modern building on the far right, the one you'll see, is the UB building. It served as a publishing house. There are 4 floors on that, including a full basement at about 23,000 square feet. So fast forward into the more recent era. In 1957, the UB Publishing Building, which is the right building, purchases both the Oddfellows Hall and the Trust buildings. And then in 1974, the properties all together after the UB started to cease production at this site were purchased by the Huntington Commercial Buildings Incorporated. In 77, when some of the major commercial uses started to leave the urban core, a lot of the prop spaces in these buildings were converted into low rent apartments, with there being some street level storefronts that continued. Again, in 1997, the property transferred to a family trust, and deferred maintenance by those previous owners and those previous decades has started to reach new levels in those buildings. We really went from a maintenance issue to a serious condition of blight and squalor right in downtown. So from 1980 to 2010, the buildings are routinely cited by the city for building, fire, and health violations. The owners are very slow to react and fix those violations. And locally, the buildings gain quite a bit of notoriety as rundown apartments, and they start to put a strain on social services and agencies and public safety departments, which are constantly deploying their resources to a very centralized location in our community. In 2011, a new administration came to power here in the city and started making some significant plans for downtown revitalization. And this is really about the same time the city starts to fully rebound from the Great Recession. And so of those downtown plans that were made, this building is one of the 5 that are identified by the city as being vacant or underutilized and therefore priority sites in our urban core. This particular set of 3 buildings occupies about a quarter of our city block, and it's across the street from the county courthouse, making it one of the largest and most visible sites in our community and our downtown. So then in 2013, we have some opportunities that arise to us here at the city. The property has consistently failed to meet minimum property tax payments and is now about $63,000 behind in those taxes. The city's building commissioner has issued an order of enforcement on the property, and at the same time, the county health officer has issued an order of unfit for human habitation. And shortly after that, the property is offered at a tax sale, and it's failed to sell at that sale. So the city's redevelopment commission requests a tax lien certificate assignment from the county commissioners, and that essentially kicks off a redemption period for the property in which the owners can come back, pay the back taxes, become current, and basically eliminate the lien that we have on that property. That doesn't happen, obviously, and so it's 2014 now, and the city has control of the site. So control is really the first step that we exercised, and that's really the launching point for how all this else came to be. And so we essentially have 3 options that we're evaluating internally. We could resell the property. A caveat of that is obviously it hasn't sold at any of the previous tax sales. And of the opportunity to sell that, would anybody who be interested in that property, who would be a responsible property owner, or would it be more essentially of the same that we have? The option for rehabilitation, sure. Who'd be interested in such a massive set of buildings? Again, quite a lot of square footage, quarter of a city block, prominent location downtown, lots of deferred maintenance. You know, who has the resources to pull this off? One of the things that the city made clear from the start was if we were going to go into the rehab route, that this was not going to be another senior housing project. Downtown already has 3 large adaptive reuse and age income restricted housing complexes, most of them in old buildings that have been rehabbed, an old hotel, an old elementary school. We've got about 161 units in the downtown, and we were just convinced that we weren't going to have that more because we needed diversity and vibrancy into the downtown to try to bring it into a creative center that we had kind of focused on. And then obviously there's always the demolition. We could create a parking lot or a plaza. We were in the process at that time of demolishing a building at the north end of our downtown and putting in a urban pocket park essentially. And so we extrapolated those figures out from that park and took it to the building here in this site, which is 3 times the size. And so we estimated that we'd have about $2.5 or $3 million into redeveloping that site into kind of open space, if you will. And then obviously additional considerations. What kind of hazardous materials? What are we going to have to abate? There's obviously a very historic nature to these buildings. And that starts to really generate some strong positions from preservation-minded advocacy groups, both at the state and local levels. It is not a local single site, but it is in a National Register district. And so John will talk a little bit about that later. At the end of the day, though, the city just viewed demolition as a viable alternative, but one of last resort. We really didn't want to go down that route unless we absolutely had to. But again, we knew it was kind of an option we did have. So we start down the process to see who out there may be interested. In 2014, we issue a request for proposal. Indiana Landmarks, which is our statewide preservation organization, and Anderson Partners submit us the sole proposal that requests a little bit of additional time because we did put some tight time frames on this thing to kind of keep it moving along. They request additional time to study the buildings, and so the city, as part of our chip in for that, we retained a structural engineer to provide an evaluation of the buildings, the set of buildings itself. John needed some time to go through some potential project feasibility, line up maybe what resources were out there to fund this project. Again, we said from the start that not senior housing, and that's typically from a redevelopment in a small town standpoint where you don't have the market-driven forces to support a project to incur so much debt. That's typically where the developers go in order to close that funding gap, as they combine tax credits and low-income housing credits and pull off a project such as this. One thing else was also for certain that we needed to stabilize those buildings. The building on the far left, as you can see in that top photo, had a roof leaking. And so the city and Landmarks partnered together to repair that leaky roof. And so we weren't going to obviously cause any further deterioration. So at the end of the day, in 2014, the city and Landmarks have entered into a formal memorandum of understanding. We did build some off-ramps and commitments into that agreement. Those off-ramps came at logical steps. If John did his due diligence and figured out, hey, the building just isn't going to fit, or we have major structural issues, we could break from that MOU on amicable terms and pursue other options, whatever they may be. And John did agree from the onset with us that his commitment would be to create market rate apartments in commercial space. John understood exactly where we were coming from in our concerns about being hesitant to additional age and income restricted housing. So then 2015 comes around, we start to lay the groundwork, start to really grow some momentum. Indiana Landmarks lists the property on its 10 most endangered list. That really garners a lot of attention across the state from individuals seeking to preserve historic structures and repurpose them to something else. Huntington Alert, which is our local historic preservation group, organizes a volunteer cleanup of the inside of the building. That serves two purposes. One, we're able to take the public through there without tripping over trash and debris and seeing some of the unsightly things that you'd normally see or that you did see in some of the earlier photos. So we can do that and help raise awareness. And two, it allows John's design teams to get on the inside without tripping over those piles, take measurements, pictures, evaluate things and things like that. And then at the kind of the conclusion of 2015, we get the structural engineering report back. That engineer finds that building, or that set of buildings rather, to be structurally sound and better than the typical set of buildings that are proposed for this sort of redevelopment. Along that same time, the city's fortunate enough, and this is where this project really ties into the presentation today, the city is awarded $350,000 in US EPA Brownfield assessment grants. And so we're able to use those grants anywhere in the city, but we primarily had a closed down asbestos manufacturing plant that we were really hoping to spend the lion's share of those funds on. We lucked out by all means in that the asbestos site was taken over by EPA's emergency response branch. So all of a sudden we have additional funds that we were planning on using there that we're able to use in other things. And so the UB project, we started a year before in 14 really with the ownership, but we didn't really have this on our radar when we were submitting the Brownfield grant. So easy to pair those two together. It made a good fit because we had started to find out some more information about the site. And so, and John's doing his due diligence, and everybody recognizes that there are the prospect of some serious environmental concerns that may need to be addressed and mitigated through the process. So we're able to take that grant and get eligibility from the EPA. And as soon as we do that, we start kicking off into our testing and assessment. And so we have SME, who the city has chosen to write our grant and administer our grant. They're a TAP partner here in Indiana. I can't say enough about finding a consulting firm that understands the task at hand and getting them in kind of boots on the ground. That'll make all the difference in a project like this, because brownfield assessment and mitigation of those things are some of the behind the scenes stuff that the newspaper is not going to come out and take pictures of. It's not John stained glass windows and popular things like that. But it is important to the overall success of this project. So SME for this particular project completes a phase 1 ESA. As you can see in the top right photo there's an underground storage tank off the back that's been covered up essentially by a loading dock. And so they've closed that in place. And for John's purposes on the inside, SME completes an asbestos and lead-bearing paint assessment. That's going to be helpful for John's contractors in the future as they start swinging hammers. Finally, a phase 2 ESA, and then using that asbestos and lead-bearing paint assessment, they create basically some technical specifications for John's contractors to use. So knowing which walls are coming down, things like that, how they're going to have to handle those particular materials given what's in there. We've got everything from hydraulic fuel tanks to old paint cans to the underground storage tank to, just the gauntlet of things that you would expect in buildings that are 100 years old. At the end of the day, though, the city was able to parlay about $65,000 in those Brownfield grant funds for use at this site. And so while that's significant, is John will talk a little bit about this, closing that funding gap between Anderson and the city and some of the other things that we had resources we had to finance and fund this project to get it off the ground. We were scrapping for dollars, and every little one counts. And so doing this due diligence for John's lenders and things like that, it's not something that we can just overlook and say, yeah, it'd be nice if we had the money, but if we don't, we won't do it. It's a must. John wants that bona fide protective purchaser protections, all those sorts of things. And so we're able to pull that off with this grant. And with that, I will hand it over to John so that he can talk a little bit more about the project.
Thanks, Brandon. John, I passed over controls to you, so if you just want to pull the slides up.
There you go. Can everybody see?
Hello.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
So my name is John Anderson. I am a tax credit attorney and a developer. So a bad combination, 25 years doing this. Mostly historic rehab projects and downtown revitalization. I always start off with this slide because it shows some of the partners that it takes to pull one of these projects off. We've actually, there are other folks here that aren't even listed that we kind of moving along through this. So I always, I love before and after photos. So this is a photo framed in my office from 1920 of these buildings. And you can see all of the activity around the building. You can't see it, but the Huntington County Courthouse is to the left across from the building. With the UB Publishing, with the Oddfellows, which were very active at the time, and then the Oddfellow Trust Building in the middle. And then fast forward to 2014. And this is unfortunately what many cities grapple with, is these buildings that were built as the centerpiece of their town, the biggest thing in their town, become this. And we often think of white elephants as the 600,000 square foot buildings in Detroit, but a white elephant is any large structure by relevance to other structures sitting in the downtown. And this certainly fit that bill when we started talking to the city about it. Some before and afters as well. Brent talked about the environmental. The environmental piece is very important to us as developers. We're working on 4 other very similar projects right now in Evansville, Union City, Crawfordsville, where we have taken similar buildings and we are doing similar things. It's important from my perspective as I come into a project that, one, the city supports what we're doing. That's the most important piece. That the city itself is ready for something like this. as we get in, and this is what I see terracotta flooring, I see original gaslight lamps, I see an original freight elevator door, beautiful stained glass archways that we can reopen, architecture that was very ahead of its time with this open-aired skylight system between some of the buildings. And that is what hooks us. And then the reality of it is all those slides Bryn showed you with the brownfields and the asbestos and the lead-based paint. And Bryn's right, the city did a great job, and Huntington Alert did a great job of organizing the cleanup effort. And they spent an entire day pulling things out of this building. And even after that, we still pulled 41 dumpsters of trash and debris out of this building, because that unfortunately was the life cycle of the building. So we saw real potential in the building despite all of this. You know, this is what happens with these buildings, is they go from being the centerpiece to not being used for their original use to nobody really cares about them. And so we end up with, I don't know what happened here, but you know, we end up with people doing things to these buildings that almost make them unusable. So we saw an opportunity here, you know, demolition versus investment, as Bryn discussed. What I always ask communities is, that's great. If a community wants to demolish a project, then what's behind it? And, you know, there's a set of buildings behind this that are not very attractive. So while there may have been a pocket park, the courthouse would have been looking at the backside of properties that are just as bad as this project was 2 years ago, 5 years ago. The need for market rate housing. And this is, you know, we are working in small towns, and this is hard to assess, and a market study doesn't quite get you there. And the reason is, in many of the small towns we work in as developers, there has not been a significant new market rate housing product built in 30 or 40 years or more. And there is a pent up demand, and we almost just have to talk to, this is what we do, we talk to the community and figure out what are they hearing and what do they need. And there's a little bit of risk and, you know, a little bit of using that information to do what we need to do and to get the rents that we need. And I will say already, this is paying off. We're opening in 2 weeks. And of the 37 units, we've already leased 6 of them. And that demand continues to be strong, but no market study would have proven that demand, no traditional market study. The repositioning of downtown Huntington. One of the great things that we have seen is when we started construction 2 years ago, a lot of scaffolding went up around town. There's been a lot of improvement in downtown. A lot of people who have owned buildings for years that they didn't see an opportunity in have now started to renovate those buildings and create some housing upstairs, you know, on the second and third floors. And so our hope is it's not just our 37 units, it's many more units that bring people downtown to Huntington. And then we've also seen businesses. And I don't know that it's completely tied to what we're doing. I think it's more a reflection of all of the great things that the city of Huntington is doing and the momentum that they have from those things. And we are just $9 million in a downtown certainly helps that. The public-private partnership. You know, these projects are incredibly expensive, as everybody knows. And so being able to maximize the asset, reposition the asset, knowing that the asset is not going to be nearly worth what we put into the asset at the end. And so it requires a public-private partnership. And then what we do as developers and as attorneys is we identify the sources. And that's always the way we look at projects from the very beginning. Financial partners on these deals, they are many and they are varied, and they go from the beginning to the end. So total project cost $9 million. The EPA Brownfield grant and the rural LISC were in on the front end of this in terms of, you know, what John and Brent have already talked about, the visioning. of Huntington with, we have local taxes in Indiana and a lot of acronyms, but CEDAT, COET, LOA. These are all local option income taxes for economic development, primarily, that can be used by the city. Tax increment financing. This is in the downtown TIF district. And the city was able to use that. And then just the vision to see that it was better to put $3 million into revitalization of this downtown structure than it was to tear this structure down and create a park. Huntington County was a partner of the commissioners. Twain Capital, we used federal historic tax credits. Those credits have become a little more difficult with recent changes in the law, and we had to deal with that through the project. So that's one of the things, is the sources and uses, and how those are structured, and how much money that brings to the deal oftentimes changes as we're working through these things. Pathfinder and First Source Bank provided construction financing. Huntington University was a great partner, and they will sublease space from Pathfinders for their entrepreneurship program. The Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs had some historic renovation grant funding. We have some of our own funding in the deal. And then last but not least, and we don't always see this happen, there was a initiative in Indiana called the Indiana Regional Cities Initiative that was announced 2.5 years ago that funded the last gap we had in the project and made this project feasible. So the project itself, John talked about his portion already, the Huntington Arts and Entrepreneurial Center. That is 13,000 square feet of the building. The building's about 48,000 square feet. That includes the Huntington University Center for Entrepreneurship. And then the part that is awesome, that creates a community downtown. It brings people downtown. And then UB Lofts, which is 37 market rate apartments. And Bren touched on this with designers and the architects and the contractors. And our approach to historic preservation is we don't just preserve the exterior, we want to preserve the space on the interior. So we do not come in and blow out all the walls so that we can build 37 apartments that look just alike. We have 37 unique. We're pushing rents, and this is something important, I think, for small towns. Huntington has about 17,000 people. It has a university that has 1,300 undergrad students. We only have 37 apartments. And so that's part of what we looked at, is how many people do we really need to reach to make this a viable downtown project. And we are charging more for these rents than certainly anyone else in Huntington. Our hope is that not only we get those rents, but those rents then give other developers and other people some confidence to come into Huntington and build more housing downtown to create a very vibrant live-work space. Here's some of the after photos. These historic buildings, and the brownfield piece of it, they all have asbestos, they all have lead-based paint. That's to be expected, but they also have surprises. We came into this building and pulled out layers and layers of flooring, and underneath, sometimes 7 layers of flooring, we found original hardwood floors. 85% to 90% of the building was original hardwood floors, which we have refinished as part of the development. All of the units have original hardwood floors except the basement. The stained glass window that was part of the Oddfellows, the grand hall, we have turned that into loft style apartments. So creating really unique space in these apartments and utilizing the volume of the space while also being able to use historic tax credits, which was a big piece of our capital stack. Even something like this, and sometimes it's the buildings are destroyed by the people that are leaving them. I don't have the before picture here, but what happened was when the UB company left, they took their presses out the front window. Really destroyed what was here. And so that was one of our challenges. As these buildings go through their life cycle from 1890 to 2015, a lot of things happen to these buildings. A lot of that is environmental, and we have to deal with that. But some of that is also structural. Some of that is just, you know, a sign of the times and how these buildings are altered, and then what we need to do with those buildings to get them back to. So economic impact is, you can imagine, a $9 million job project in a smaller rural community in Indiana has real impact. Construction and permanent jobs. We do our best on all of our projects to use local contractors where we can, so that there is an impact in the city that we're working in. Making versus parking lot. I'm obviously partial to historic buildings. I always think it's better to save a historic building than it is to create a parking lot, or to create a pocket park. And so the city of Huntington, thankfully, through their leadership, recognized that and did that as well. Adding 37 plus new downtown residents for the market rate housing options, attraction and retention. So one of the things we hear in all the towns we go to is we have jobs, but we don't have anywhere for people to live. And so when people take jobs, they live elsewhere. And we're creating market rate options, housing options for Huntington. And property taxes, local income taxes, obviously there's an economic benefit there. And also just promoting the downtown identity that has already started for many years to promote with the arts and with small business and creating some vibrancy. And there's the rendering. Unfortunately, I don't have any current photos because I haven't been up there in the last couple of weeks, but this is the rendering. So if you look at where we started in 2014 with the plywood and everything else, this is how the building looks today. And we will start leasing to opening the building to tenants in the next couple of weeks. John, I don't know, John, do you have anything you want to add here on the Arts Council with these slides?
Earlier, can you hear me?
Yeah.
The only thing I really didn't talk about earlier is a complete commercial kitchen with commissary and culinary arts, which is our biggest expenditure in the site, and hopefully having food for the residents as well. So they can come down, just come on over and have dinner or lunch or whatever they need. So it's going to be a fun. University is going to be there to help people who make things create their own businesses. And that's what's going to be fun about this as well. So it's really a full partnership among everybody concerned, and it's going to really improve our ability to attract people into Huntington and be a place where people as well to visit.
And I will echo what John said. The key to this project happening was the partnership we were able to form with the city, with Pathfinders, with the university, with the funding from LISC Rural and EPA that came in up front. There were a lot of steps along the way, and as Bren said, a lot of off-ramps where any of us could have decided not to do this project. And these are difficult projects. But we nonetheless stayed the course, and now we have a project that I think everybody is very proud of.
Great. Thanks so much, John. It's incredible to see that transformation and the collaboration that took place. I am going to pass it off to Blaze. Earlier, Bryn made a comment about the importance of finding a good consultant who really understands the task at hand at the Brownfield site. And that is certainly Blaze, who is with the EPA Technical Assistance to Brownfield Program.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to get my slides up here. Tell me if you can see them. Can you see a title slide?
Very good, yes.
Awesome, thanks. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. We've certainly heard a great story that's happened over and over again in different places, thanks to cities and nonprofits that utilize the EPA Brownfields resources. And so I'll be giving you kind of an overview of what those are that helped kind of spur this project on in Huntington. So I'm the director of the Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. at Kansas State University. We work in 21 states across kind of the middle of the country, including Indiana. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our program in a second, but just want to try to talk at a high level about how these EPA brownfields resources support local governments like Huntington City and nonprofits like some LISC members in facilitating projects like we heard about. And this takes place not only in big cities, but in smaller cities as well. So certainly in many ways focused on smaller city revitalization efforts. And that's, again, helping those cities and nonprofits kind of broker and facilitate visioning and planning work that we heard that kind of set the stage for the project in Huntington, pays for the environmental work or some of the environmental work, and again, efforts to facilitate partnerships that eventually get the properties redeveloped. And so again, we heard, brownfields defined a little bit earlier, but it's, not any kind of contaminated site or potentially contaminated site. It's one where those contaminants could be kind of holding up reuse or redevelopment of a building or of a project. So what's so critical about the environmental resources that and the funding that comes to play that cities and nonprofits can use is they can get environmental work done on behalf of potential buyers and sellers, and that gives them liability protections that helps them feel comfortable moving forward and implementing a project like we heard about. And again, so when we're talking about the roles cities and nonprofits play, that's, we heard about these, so I'll go just very quickly through these, but basically it's setting the plate for the redevelopment. So identifying stakeholders, prioritizing sites, getting some high-level planning done. The resources will also pay for the environmental work, right? Or a lot of the environmental work that's key up front. And this is really the primary, focus of the EPA dollars. It's really to get the environmental assessment and at least some of the cleanup done. And it also, though, provides those organizations the capacity and the funds needed to pull partners together, which is so important on these distressed sites. So kind of the laundry list of EPA brownfields resources is laid out in this slide. On the left are resources that are, maybe tens of thousands of dollars that are requested on a project by project basis. So for example, the technical assistance that the TAB program provides or other providers give are listed here. And the phase 1 and phase 2 assessments and sometimes cleanup money are listed under services that regional EPA offices or state and tribal brownfields programs can provide, again, on an as requested basis, kind of smallish projects. On the right side of the sleeve on the screen are the kinds of grants and resources that the city of Huntington competed for successfully. And so these are for large, numerous or large individual projects. And I'll show you a kind of a breakdown of this. But again, the whole idea is to pay for that assessment and cleanup, those cleanup expenditures. Some planning can take place as well, but again, the emphasis is getting environmental assessments and cleanups done. You'll also see there's also a type of grant that can be applied for that's a job training and workforce development grant. And so if a plan or a plan in a city, let's say, is to develop a cluster of different types of say renewable energy type activities, and you need to train a workforce to do that, whether it's wind or solar on brownfield or something like that. This kind of grant can support community colleges and VOTEC type training for that. Kind of helps round out the, another piece of the puzzle sometimes that's needed to really implement redevelopment. So this is a spreadsheet of just the different types of competitive assessment, environmental assessment and cleanup grants that are out there. And so the thing to note on this is that they're usually hundreds of thousands of dollars, up to $1 million in some cases. City of Huntington successfully applied for one of the assessment grants, which turned out to be $350,000. You can do that with a waiver. You'll notice in this slide too, and I imagine you'll be able to download these at some point from LISC. The eligibility, who can apply for these? It's going to be local governments and certain nonprofits, the 501c3s, and that meet certain requirements. So again, it's not just for cities. It's a good thing to remember. CDCs and regional planning organizations type groups, I'm sure some LISC members can apply for these and play this role in a community as well. Okay, there's a lot of federal, state, and local funding, as we heard in the case study in Huntington, that leverages really well with the EPA money. And in fact, you can usually compete more successfully for the EPA money if you're working with other types of funding, that there's other types of funding being brought to the table. So, it makes a project more feasible financially. So again, LISC members and partners, come to the table with money, provide financing. So again, it's kind of a fit for LISC, the LISC network to be, to know and work with the EPA funding and apply for it. So kind of in the practical view of bringing Brownfield's resources to a project, again, the whole idea is to look at an area, prioritize, find a location or a project that is a priority in a community, engage the community, prioritize the sites, plan for reuses, and then think about who your partners are, who has the Brownfields resources in your area. Are you going to go to the state or apply for a federal grant? Does somebody already have a grant? Should you apply for a grant? If you're eligible and you're playing a role in revitalizing your community. The point of the city always being on board, though, regardless of who's doing things, is a super important one that was illustrated well in the Huntington case study. But early on, you're thinking about what needs to be, what's the project going to be, and who has the resources. Once a site's identified, some planning's done, certainly you need a cooperative owner. In this case, the city took the property, so they're the cooperative owner. But if it's a private owner, they need to cooperate. It's important to have a potential buyer. The city or the nonprofit can get the environmental assessment work done on behalf of that future buyer, so that future buyer is going to have those liability protections from kind of future environmental issues. A phase 2 environmental assessment can be done to kind of figure out those abatement costs, whether they're asbestos, lead-based paint, tanks, whatever may need to be addressed. Once you've done that, then that new owner is in a position to safely acquire the title. The title's been cleaned, if you will, of future environmental liability. And hopefully there is, money in the pot to get this environmental work done. And again, the resources you can turn to are listed at the bottom of the slide. It's super important to do the environmental assessment work before the property changes hands. That's super critical. Those liability protections. Okay, and again, if cleanup is needed, there are grants that can be used to pay for that. It could be state funding, other revolving loans, etc., local funding instruments. And certainly LISC is a big player in helping provide and broker different types of funds, as well as the developers who, like we've heard, are competent and good at accessing various types of tax credits and things that they're expert in. And so just want to give a quick plug for the technical assistance providers out there that can help for free, because it is free. You can get quite a bit of planning, kind of some environmental back pocket advice, and economic development expertise out of the TAB providers. Again, Kansas State provides technical assistance to cities and nonprofits in the purple shaded areas across the middle of the country. Another organization called the Center for Creative Land Recycling on the West Coast, and one of the East Coast states help in those areas. And then New Jersey Institute of Technology provides assistance in states on the West Coast, or I'm sorry, East Coast. Here's some contact information for each of them. I'm in the middle, but again, Sarah Seeloff and Gary White, Let Santasiere are good points of contact. We use, and K-State in particular, uses many subject matter experts, and we assemble them in teams according to what a city or nonprofit is trying to do and request the technical assistance they're requesting. So just showing that there's quite a variety of help out there, from planning to environmental expertise to, again, to the economic development expertise. And this kind of, shows some examples of what some of those things are. I'll mention that for cities or nonprofits wanting to inventory potential brownfields or revitalization projects, we have a site database you can use for your internal planning, as well as a smartphone app. You can do windshield tours of an area, take pictures, like GPS locations, all for your internal planning and prioritization of sites. We have landscape architects that can do renderings of community-based stakeholder input for preferences for redevelopment. We can also work with developers in the mix as well. It just all has to be kind of brokered by the city or the nonprofit. With respect to redevelopment, we can actually help identify public funding sources that may be specifically right for the type of development you're trying to do. And if you're interested in applying for the big grants that EPA offers, we have a grant writing tool you can use online, and we also review drafts of proposals before they're submitted. And I wanted to add that these grant applications, a competition for that type of funding happens every late summer and fall. So you'll want to, you can find an EPA Brownfields webpage and just kind of be watching for the announcement. It does take a while to get prepared, so that's something TAB can help you with if you're interested. And now's a good time to start preparing for a fall application if you want to compete well, because they're quite competitive. As far as help from TAB, there's no real application process other than you pick up the phone or get on your computer and email us, call us. We'll review your needs and our capabilities and see if we can help and get started helping you. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and thank the LISC and the other presenters for the honor of getting to talk to you today about Brownfields resources and getting to hear about a great story. I will stop sharing my screen once I have a little thing here visible to me.
Okay, thanks so much, Blaise. What an incredible suite of resources. And we will be sure to share everyone's slide afterwards, so folks have all that information around contact. We are just at time, but we did want to see if anyone had a quick question that we could squeeze in before we thank everyone for joining us. Otherwise, want to make sure that folks can feel comfortable reaching out to the presenters as well as look for the materials that we'll send as a follow-up. So are there any questions? I can unmute folks, or feel free to just chat them over to me. All right. Well, hearing none, thank you so much to everyone who joined, and thank you so much to our presenters for sharing this case study and sharing all the resources that are available to both cities as well as our CDC partners.
Okay, thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.